This project is called ReUnited, and what we are doing is trying to bring together the writers, the performers, and the artists of the 80s and 90s who were responding to the politics and the activism of the 70s and the 60s even. We'll find out a little bit more about that in a minute. This particular roundtable is called TV and Media because the beginning of this project was the digitisation of the Eastern Eye archive, 2 series of Channel 4's programme, which first went out in 1982. And it struck us that this was a turning point. It was the first time that there had been a national audience for first-generation British South Asian artists. And we started to look at that, and then we thought, goodness, there was an awful lot happening at that time. The Arts Council was starting to give out funding. There was something called Section 11 funding. The GLC had this huge multicultural program that was being pushed through and was on the front pages of every newspaper. Something was happening in response to all of that protest and the politics and the prejudice that had come before. And so what we're trying to do is capture with these round tables a moment in time, or several moments. We are not trying to create a definitive timeline. What we're doing is an approximation of a timeline. And what my superb guests here today are going to do is to share their knowledge, their experiences, their stories, to help us get a picture of what was happening in that time. And because this particular roundtable is called TV and Media, we're talking to people who were commissioning work, fighting for money, commissioning artists, creating content, not necessarily the artists themselves, though we have a writer and we have an artist, but people who were making change top down for those who would come. And in our future roundtables, we'll be looking at those who are doing bottom up with their own companies, and we'll also be looking at those who are going out sideways by creating exhibitions and events for other people like them. With me today are, I'll sort of go here, I'm not going to say anything more about them than very basics because they're going to each talk for 5 minutes in a half a second. Samir Shah, who is Chief Executive of Juniper Productions, which is his independent television company. He recently was awarded the RTS Lifetime Award, which is the ultimate accolade if you're in television, as everybody would know. Farrukh Dhondy, writer, activist. They both have their hands in Channel 4. Suman Bhuchar, who is, well, what are you? You're an entrepreneur, an archivist. She's a woman who has worked in South Asian arts, first generation South Asian arts, for 20, 30, 40 years. Keith Khan, probably you know him from him designing the Olympic Games opening, but actually he was starting in the 80s as an artist and as an impresario. Anita Bhalla, also from Eastern Eye, and I should say I'm also from Eastern Eye. We all have a link to Eastern Eye, but currently the chief of Birmingham Music and the Innova Gallery and just about everything Birmingham actually, which is just as well because the SADAA archive is housed at Birmingham Museum and Gallery, and on the end is Sara Wajid, who is chief executive of Birmingham Museum, which is 8 museums, so that says an awful lot. And tonight you find us in the Think Tank Gallery, Think Tank Theatre, which is the Science Museum part. And I must thank at this point the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which is supporting us, and Birmingham Museums Trust, which is our partner in this. So I'm going to ask Farrukh to kick off because you can give us the social and political landscape against which change was happening through the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s and 90s. Farrukh, tell us what you were doing then,
right.
And then...
Well, let me start by saying that the new communities of Britain, Asian, West Indian, African, did not come here to contribute to the culture of Britain. They came here to work because the white working class had abandoned particular sorts of jobs after the Second World War. They voted Churchill out and voted Clement Attlee in, and they had abandoned the jobs that they thought were beneath them. And the immigrants from the ex-colonies, India, of course, had got its independence in 47, but India, Pakistan, and then East Pakistan, Bangladesh, sent in people who were fleeing not abject poverty, but wanted to better themselves and came to Britain to work. And they filled those jobs, and there was no thought of contributing to a multicultural Britain. I came to Britain in the middle 60s. Pardon me for being personal, but the story, if it's told in abstracts, gets boring. If it's told personally, it might be interesting. I came here on a scholarship to Cambridge, and all the ethnics, if you like, the Asians, the West Indians, the Africans, very few of us in the whole university were all from abroad. There was nobody from Birmingham, Manchester, London. There were no children or people, descendants or part of the immigrant community of Britain. We were all foreign students. Now, I didn't realize that there were so many workers working in jobs silently, quietly, without attention, until some years later, I did a postgraduate in Leicester University. And of course, one found that the main problem that one faced was not cultural but political. That we talked about racism in housing, racism in employment, racism in going to pubs who would serve you, racism in landlords who would say, we don't want any Asians here. And so I faced that when I got out of Cambridge myself. And when I got to Leicester, I took up with because we could only afford, me and my then partner could only afford half a pint of beer on a Friday night. We went to a house in the ghetto where we lived, Narborough Road, which was the Asian district of Leicester. We went to a pub. I think it was called the Pack Horse, but people called it the Packy Horse. And we turned up there, and we used to drink half pints. And one day, on a Friday evening, a whole heap of Asian workers turned up, Punjabi workers in the main. And they said, they came up to us in the bar and said, are you Asians? And my then partner, Mala, was wearing a shalwar kameez and said, what do you think? And I said, yes, I too am Indian. And they said, come here. And soon there were 6 pints of bitter spread out before us. We could only afford half a pint. And we made friends with them. And soon it became apparent that there were political issues. On the third or fourth or fifth night that we met them, some of them had been dismissed from their factory, right? And I tell you this because it led me to try and think, what is the solution to their political problem? And it was from there that I got involved in the activation of Asian demands for rights. And just as in America, the Black population has contributed culturally through its oppression, so also the new communities of Britain and their culture, their books, their appearance on television begins with their political situation and their political deprivations in Britain. And what happened was, from being a member of the, from having solved, if you like, the crisis of their dismissal in Leicester, right, became a kind of honorary secretary of the Indian Workers Association. They appointed me as such, came down to London and joined the only sensible organization I found of the new communities of immigrants, which was called the Black Panther Movement. And being a member of that, I began to participate, to edit, because I was, I suppose, a little more literate than the rest of the members, to edit the newspaper called Freedom News. And one day, a gentleman called C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian Marxist philosopher, turned up, and there were 200 of us in the room, and he said, who writes this paper? And people raised their hands, and who edits it? I raised my hand. And he said, why do you write such nonsense? Why don't you write about what you do? And so we said, what do you mean? And he said, what do you do? The guy said, I'm a bus driver. Said, well, where do you go in the mornings? At 5 o'clock, I turn up at the garage and this and that. What relationship do you have with your colleagues? What relationship do you have with the public who go on your buses and this and that? And he began to say something. He said, well, write about that. That's the way you'll get people to understand who you are and what your movement is about, rather than writing Leninist stuff. And he turned to others. Somebody was a nurse, somebody was unemployed, turned to me. I said, I'm a school teacher, which is how I was earning my living at the time. And he said, write about what happens in schools. And I thought, yes, right, I could do that. I've always wanted to be a writer, but it hadn't occurred to me that there was any opportunity to so do.
It's quite interesting, because in our next round table, what we've got is all of those companies that started from that place, though I think you were one of those people who helped set where that place was. And so we have Tara Arts, we have Tamasha, we have Kali, we have all of those coming next week, which I think you have just explained from where that anger came and from where the need to write the narratives.
It absolutely came from the political deprivations that the Black community and the struggle that they were putting up against these deprivations.
Well, so then what we have is that response, which is a very slow response. It takes 20 years for money to be released, for the Race Relations Act to have some value.
Shama, it happened much faster with me because I was in the right place at the right time. Let me tell you about it.
Only if you tell me very quickly, because 5 minutes is up.
I wrote these articles about my school experience, fight at the fifth form disco and so on, and wrote 25 of those. And then a guy comes up to me in the staff room at the school, a fellow in a gray suit, and he says, are you Farrukh Dhondy? And I said, does he owe you money? And he said, no. I said, are you from the police? He said, no. I said, what do you want? He said, I'm from Macmillan's Publishing. The market for multicultural writing exists, but the books don't. And he said, can we use your article? I said, how do you know they're my articles? He said, the guy who sends me the newspaper told me that it's from Farrukh. And he traced me back from Farrukh through the ILEA. He said only one Farrukh could exist. And I said, hang on, I don't want you to compile these articles they're just journalistic articles. You're looking at the Hemingway of India, I'll write you some proper stories. And he said, okay. And that was the first book, East End at Your Feet. And it was how politics transformed into culture. And I think that happened in every case all the way through.
Okay, that's a really beautiful example, actually, and it does neatly bring me to Samir Shah.
Oh. I thought I was going to be last.
No, you're second, because actually one of the responses to that was the setting up of Channel 4, which was to give voices, those voices are on the hinterlands, the opportunity to be heard. And I don't know if it was just a public service song, what was created did make quite a big dent in, I think, not just the work and understanding of those first generation South Asian artists, but also the population of the UK who had not understood what these communities were doing and what it looked like. They weren't even bothering to look in, and suddenly it was on the screen. Samir, just explain to us how that came about and what your thinking was as the producer of Eastern Eye, the deviser of it.
Okay. Let me just tell you a bit about Channel 4. Because remember, Channel 4 emerged in the white heat of Thatcherism. So you'd think, well, that's a bit surprising, isn't it? That this channel... Now, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but Willie Whitelaw was Thatcher's deputy. And he envisaged Channel 4 to be absolutely minority channel, but things like fishing and that kind of stuff, minority sports, taken into leisure activities. It was when Jeremy Isaacs made the bid to take over Channel 4 that he articulated it as an alternative to the mainstream public service broadcasting BBC, an alternative that voiced the voices, the marginal figures, the minority communities, and he pitched it that way, and he won the. But in fact, both people who went for it, Jeremy Isaacs and John Burt, both had this idea of it being a voice for minorities, but Jeremy won. John Burt at the time ran the company I was working for, London Weekend Television. And London Weekend Television was one of the ITV companies that famously had a license to print money. It was making a lot of money. And under the kind of compliance rules, John Burt understood that to continue to get the license, London Weekend Television had to speak to the London community. And John's a very clever man, and he understood the changes that Farrukh was talking about. He understood the demography of London was changing. It was becoming a multicultural city. And that he could invent programs that address that change, tick the compliance issue, and make programs that fit with his own vision for Channel 4. And out of that thinking, we can come back to about Channel 4 and LWT and the relationship. It was out of that thinking that John came up with the idea of Eastern Eye and Black on Black, and I would say forced it on Channel 4 because the ITV companies owned Channel 4 at the time, and they took all the money back. So for Sue Woodford, if she was here, and Farrukh will agree, effectively, they didn't have any money because LWT took it all and they made these programs. So we can come to that a bit later on. So Eastern Eye was created. I was at the time working on a program called Weekend World, which was the company's flagship current affairs program. And it had a particular kind of journalism, very analytical, very policy oriented. And when I took over Eastern Eye, I brought those sensibilities to the population we were talking to. So in its first iteration, Eastern Eye, very early on, was quite journalistically led and analytical, and told stories about the Asian community. And we had a little bit at the end, which Sharma was involved in. It was a bit kind of, it
was the best bit.
No, you're stealing my thunder there. It was a bit of frippery with a bit of few artists here and there.
Frippery.
And the program went out late at night, 11 o'clock. And then the feedback came. It was complete slam dunk that this was the stuff they liked, and they fell asleep with the stuff of the heavy journalism. We'll come to your point. But as a result, we turned Eastern Eye around, and we continued to do some journalism, but it moved apart to become a showcase for the whole range of social and cultural life that existed within the Asian community of London. And one of the visions there, and Sue would agree with this, and that's why it became a magazine show, was that the Asian community in London, if you lived there, you didn't wake up feeling, oh my God, I'm oppressed. Actually, you went to see movies, you had good time, you had fun, you did things, you enjoyed things, you had nice food. And we wanted to capture the full range of Asian cultural life.
But we weren't just in London. No,
but what I'm saying, but what we were trying to do is to say to people, we're more than just a problem. We actually have our own agency, we do our own things, and we want to celebrate it. And that's what we did. And that's how we came to it.
And in fact, a lot of the stars of today broke their wind, but actually got wind under their wings on Eastern Eye. And really, our household names today, and they came to us even as teenagers, so just asking us, how did you make it? Because they had never before had a national platform for the work that they were doing, or the work that they wanted to do, because often the problem is not knowing how to enter the world of the creative arts in any way, shape or form, if you come from communities where it's not a norm. So Suman, let me move here to you, because you were a young thing and into the GLC you go, and you find yourself at the cutting edge, actually, of much to do with British South Asian arts, the first generation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shema. Yeah, I mean, I was a young student at the time, and I was part of a theatre company called Tara Arts. But when I finished my university, my first job was working with the GLC in what was called the Ethnic Minorities Unit. And I joined in 1984 when they were doing something called the Anti-Racist Year. And I had to bring all the stuff to show you, because things we take for granted now, lots of activities and events that they did were quite new and quite radical at that particular time. Simple things like trying to introduce audiences to a range of film work that was around that people could use in schools for education, that came from different communities, Asian, Black, Latin American, Irish, working class, very different. But also alongside, let's say, promoting a different vision of London and a different perspective, which was a kind of left-wing, I'm using that in inverted commas, it was like a left view. I think the GLC, also before Channel 4 was set up, was quite important in supporting what they called at the time ethnic arts, which was the word that had been coined by Naseem Khan in her report, The Art Britain Ignores, which was done in 1976. But I think some of the thinking of how artists who were working in, let's say, just London, because they only talk about London and so on, could be supported and resourced to be able to make work and grow. And if we're talking about TV and media, for example, the workshop sector, which was a lot of, let's say there was a community of Black and Asian filmmakers who wanted to find a route into making film, and the filmmaking structure was quite closed. And in order to be able to do that, they created a kind of a cooperative way of working, which was then ratified by the union, the ACTT. The GLC was involved in supporting some of the workshops that existed, of which say Retake, Chedo, Sankofa, Black Audio. And then when Channel 4 was created, they also supported that sector. So some of the films and things that they made, they were shown on the channel. And also even before Samir, before you did Eastern Ice, Sue Woodford used to make that program called Bacchanal, if you remember it, before Farrukh joined Channel 4 as the multicultural commissioning editor. So I'm saying that in a way, all these things were kind of happening in parallel lines in London. So there was a sort of a, what do you call it, a catalyst of activism in a certain way, and facilitated to a certain degree by support in local government through the GLC, which is like a London-wide council,
But we're kind of talking a lot about London, but the GLC was on the front pages of every newspaper every single day, opprobrium over its multicultural agenda and its diversity and whatever. So although it was London, it was actually influencing the whole country. It was everywhere.
Perhaps, but its remit to run and support artists was just London-based, pretty much, really. And I know that there were other regional councils in some of the bigger metropolitan boroughs, like, say, Manchester and Birmingham. They might have picked up influences, but I can only just talk about what was going on in London. And yes, it did create opprobrium because Margaret Thatcher was on the other side of the river and the GLC is on one side of the river, and you can see each other from, if you were sitting on the terrace anyway. So it would have been upsetting. But I mean, the main thing is that there was a lot of activism, and there was a lot of young people, the children of these migrant workers, people who'd come in the 60s and 70s, who had by then grown up in British schools, who were artists or creative people, and they wanted to be able to find a way of doing things, but there was no opportunity for them. And at the same time, there was a lot of interest in our colonial story, let's say. Nobody talked about it in the same way. Even now, people are still calling for history to be taught, and Farrukh is talking about getting a chance to be a writer, of writing novels for young people. I mean, there is still a lack of that right now in the publishing industry. So all these things were happening collectively, and they were a kind of catalyst for some sort of change. There was some money given to what was then called ethnic arts, of which, as I said, Asian, Black, Latin American, Irish, you just name it. Everything that was not straight mainstream went into that. I mean, I'll stop here, but I'm happy to continue. I did bring some stuff
Yes.
because I wanted to say that, you know, by 1985, Thatcher had decided she was going to abolish the GLC, and then it made some flagship projects like Creator Gallery,
Hold it
for
up.
example.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is an exhibition of Black arts work. For example,
Yeah,
they
just
put
keep
money
holding
into
it.
the Horizon Gallery, which ran for a few years and promoted the work of South Asian artists. It facilitated publishing. Kala Press, Rashida Ryan did his first ever thing, Making Myself Visible. And the late Mahmood Jamal, his first book of poetry, Silence Inside a Gun's Mouth, was published by support from the GLC. So I think it was a catalyst in many ways to facilitate the development of a kind of creative and arts sector.
Lovely. Keith, I mean, you would have been, I think, somebody who would have been being both top down in terms of commissioning stuff, but also quite curious about your own practice.
Well, I mean, it's great to see this stuff. It just made me think I'd forgotten that the Roundhouse was a Black Arts Centre at that point in time. And what I was going to talk about, apart from the fact that clearly we got the note about brown corduroy, Farrukh and myself, but the landscape in which we were working was very different. And there was a political alignment of minority interests that was fascinating in the 80s. So, for example, I think everybody was outside the South Africa House on the Free Nelson Mandela protests. There was an alignment to feminist politics, to gay politics. Don't forget that there was a very, very strong AIDS. I mean, I went through art school as a gay man with the whole spectrum of AIDS and the death penalty and the horrors that all talk about plague back then and how that was treated. And I do remember why I think I managed to develop projects was that it was a great moment where these things started to collide. Black at that time meant everything, including Asian. So it was a catch-all term, and it included gay, it included that. And so we would always go on other people's demonstrations. We would always support the Black sisters, or we would support the Asian lesbians or the whatever. The point is that we joined up. In addition to that, there was a much freer economy. I know that I paid for myself through art school by selling shirts in Camden Market. I know that there was a thing called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which was a way where you could get money from the government to set up your own business, which is exactly what I did. And I was lucky enough, in fact, to have designed very early in my career one of Farrukh's programs called On the Other Hand, which was a talk show specifically about Asian issues. That was a late night program meant to replace or meant to parallel After Dark back then. And that was a great opportunity. I mean, I was like 26. That opportunity, and it's a shame because I don't know when those opportunities will happen for younger people. I came from Trinidad, and I think my work with the Asian community as per se was all colored by that, because my idea was just put people together. And I started a Notting Hill Carnival with the Roundhouse, with Greta Mendes doing Carnival. And I basically replicated a Caribbean African system of joint making. And that's what I replicated, and that became my company. So I started by trying to join people up. Doesn't matter where you are, as long as you're some kind of minority, come and join us. So we basically built a kind of coterie of artists, which was fantastic. And that's where my first show, Flying Costumes, came from when I was 26, which would never be made now because it had a very strong Muslim theme. It was based on Husay, but it had 142 people in it in Birmingham and not in Birmingham, Bristol and London. It was great fun. And because of my carnival background, I ended up in one of the most thorny political projects of the time, which was fascinating, which was the Millennium Dome, which is post all of this. And I was the costume designer, in fact, at the opening ceremony. And I did the central show with Peter Gabriel as a designer, because I come from carnival. They wanted big things. They wanted that. And they wanted our diversity. They you know. So I was just going to focus a little bit on, there was a kind of liberal agenda. We also made money back in the 80s by doing this thing which was called AIMS, which is Art Education for a Multicultural Society, which was a government-funded national system where Black artists were sent to white neighborhoods. That was really challenging and really fascinating when you got sent to Runcorn and places where they'd not seen Black people before. It was fascinating. So the Millennium Dome was a fascinating moment because that was so much coloured by the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which had also happened in 1999. And everyone says that the whole thing was blighted by the police slowing up the queues of people coming in to see the show, which was back then. So I was just going to really kind of focus on the fact that we were entrepreneurs because we took advantage of what was available to us and we tried to join things up. But I was really fascinated by how do we bring a new audience into this? How do we create a space where we can be visible?
So yes, and so I think what you're encompassing there is the hope of that sort of turning point after all of the anger and the activism that's, you know, that's sort of churning stuff out, and now you're starting to create hope and joy out of it. Anita, you and I both co-presented Eastern Eye with Aziz Kurta for Samir, which is why, of course, it was such a great program. But you went on to do so many things, including setting up the Asian Network for the BBC. And I just want you to kind of explain what it was like in the 80s and how that was developed and why.
I'm going to take you back just slightly. My parents came here in the 60s. My father was a factory worker. My mum was the first woman Asian woman to work on the factory floor at Cadbury's here. And growing up in that environment, nobody else in school looked like me. There was another agenda for me, and having a mum like mine, which was the female agenda. There was feminism, there were women, what we were doing with our women in factories. So my cultural offering at home on a tiny little black and white television in a two-down terrace in Handsworth was Zindagi Na Jeevan, 10 minutes of programming, or listening to pop music with my friends as I grew up. So after I'd finished college, I trained as a teacher. I went to Leicester as a community relations officer to take up a role looking at how we worked with Asian women and young Black children, and men, boys, particularly men at that time, because of the police issues with young Black boys. And because for Asian women, apart from Black sisters in Leicester, we didn't have any hostels outside of London. So I got very involved in community politics. I had picked that up at university as well, you know, going to Grunwich, going on strike. So that was my background. And that's not surprising if you think about what my parents were doing. My father was a shop steward. So when, do you remember a program called Brass Tacks?
Yeah.
They made a program about my setting up this hostel, demonstrating against the National Front every Saturday in Leicester. And on the back of that, the BBC came to me and said, oh, we'd like to offer you a radio presenting job. And I said, no way, because to me, the state of the BBC is part of the other side. And as a community activist, I thought if I move to the other side, nobody's going to talk to me. You know, I had an agenda, which was to get hostels sorted, thinking about racism, fighting on the streets. But eventually, I did take on the role at the BBC to go in and present for just 2 hours a week, because I'd moved back to Birmingham and it was at Pebble Mill. We had the biggest bag of mail, the 2-hour Asian program when I joined. We would go in at night, scuttle in as if we were mice in the dark, do our program and disappear. Nobody acknowledged that we existed. There was that we had audiences. We had thousands of people from the local community listening. And it took some time for the BBC to think that actually maybe we need to develop this. So in the 80s, very early 80s, 81, 82, I was broadcasting. We went from 2 hours to 4 hours. We still had the television Asian programs developing. I started doing a bit of presenting on that. Again, interesting, a lot of letters came to the Asian program, television program, because I didn't wear salwar kameez, I didn't wear a sari, and I didn't speak in English. So there was some members of the Asian community saying, get her off the screen. She's not like us. We don't want our young people to be like her. So, I was kind of feeling the heat from all sides. I took on the challenge to set up the Asian programs in 6 months in 87. I took a career break and said, I'll have a go at this. Now, it's interesting, why did the BBC want to do that? And I think that's a really important question. I don't believe it's because they felt they wanted to really engage with the community in any meaningful way. There was a reason. We were broadcasting on 1458 frequency. The BBC wanted that frequency because the radio authority, they wanted the frequency. There was a battle for the frequency. And yes, there were some people in the BBC who really felt that we needed to address our audiences, the Asian communities, because we were growing, our voice was growing, our economy was growing. But it was actually, I think, initially, the lobbying was around creating this spine on the 1458 Asian network medium wave frequency, so the BBC could keep it. But when I did take on the challenge, for me, the challenge was, how do we suddenly overnight create 7 days of programming when we've only had 4 hours with very little resource? I was sort of one of the physical resources. So I literally took people off the street. Rita Chakrabarti, we see, it was one of the first people, Sonia Diol, who passed through us. Then the next challenge was, how do we divide this network so there's some element of educating form? And we did take on some campaigning issues. We did tackle, the AIDS question, and I got it in the neck lots of times for doing that. But thankfully, I think I had a producer who stood by me, say, yes, of course, if that's a debate we need to have. But the vitriol and the letters saying, how dare you tackle AIDS in our community? It doesn't exist, it doesn't happen. Then my next challenge is, how do you divide 7 days of programming so you get a sense of where we want to go? We developed youth programming, national programming, then language programs. And arts programs. So music, arts, everything. But there's a dilemma, because if we played too many Gujarati songs, we would have people saying, why are you playing Gujarati song? Why have the Bangladeshi community got an hour here? Why do we not have more Hindustani? So all of that cultural battle was going on. But the great thing was we started attracting Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the big actors would start coming to us, Imran Khan, and that's just to start. So the Asian network grew from what I think was quite a cynical start from the BBC's point of view.
Of course, it is still going very strong, and it is still a place where people are platformed for their writing, for their performance, for their artistry. And what makes this slightly different today, which I must reiterate, is that we're talking to the artists about the art in the next 2 roundtables. Today, we really are looking at process and how all of this started, how it was set up, and how we were having to work around rules, regulations, funding to get it right at that time in the 80s. So I'm just bringing that in case somebody's sort of saying, well, why are you not talking more about art in this particular stage? This is the TV and media. This is the setting up of top-down change, which brings me to Sara Wajid. Sara, actually, you were one of the first people to help with the creation of what is now SADAA, but was then SALIDA. You've stayed within the heritage space, the legacy space, and we are capturing today these stories and memories precisely because we want to just get a moment in time. We want to create an approximation of people's experiences in that time. Why is that important?
I mean, you can imagine being in the business of history, being a museum director, I'm just drinking in this conversation. I mean, this is why I do what I do. And being one of the first kind of people involved in SADAA, as it was then SALIDA, the rationale for South Asian Arts Archive at that time, it probably seemed quite esoteric. Like, I remember I joined SADAA in 2007. It had been established in 1999. And back then, it was still the early days of digital culture, really, and the internet. So if I'd met people and told them what I did, you get this kind of like, what now? You run like a digital art archive about Asian culture? That was like extremely abstract and esoteric as a concept. But actually, it was coming out of a lot of these issues that you're talking about erasure and the importance of cultural heritage. In a sense, it was part of the anti-racist movement, but it was just quite a rarefied end of that. So it was set up by, essentially it was quite a research-driven concept in those early days. It was scholars who really set it up, scholars, playwrights, quite formidable Asian feminists in their sort of, some of them in their 80s, who felt that this generation of artists and writers and thinkers were dying and disappearing, and their archives were being lost, and the memories of their work and their important kind of place in the cultural heritage of Britain was unacknowledged and erased. And so now you can just Google and look everything up, and you'll find out all of these stories, and people will be Googling and hopefully hearing this, you know, recording. But then there wasn't that sense of like this information is just at your fingertips. So when I joined SADAA, I was discovering about people like Ram Gopal, you know, a queer Asian writer like Suniti Namjoshi. I hadn't even heard of her. You know, she was born in 1940s. At that time, that was an absolute revelation. And I was getting that education through this archive, through building this archive. And at that time, there was a massive sort of vacuum gap, if you want, between, on the one hand, you know, Apache Indian, and then just a sort of like nostalgia, sort of merchant ivory, jewel in the crown, Victorian era representations of the Raj, essentially. And for what, you know, I was part of the generation that you called, you know, at the time we thought of ourselves as second generation. I was born in 1973. And that was really it. It was Apache Indian or the 19th century. And then suddenly this gap that I always kind of wondered, was there nothing in between? Was there nobody doing anything? So to find out about writers like Atiya Hussain was really important to my generation, because my mum was an Urdu language radio producer at the BBC World Service. And sometimes I would see her older colleagues and sort of think, this means that these guys were doing this work in the 50s in London or in, you know, all over the world, and they were being broadcast and understood all around the world. But like, we don't know about that. There's no kind of connection back to that. So when I found out that, oh, there had been someone before my mum, there had been Atiya Hussain and all of these other people, a lot of them seemed quite posh and quite removed. But, you know, actually, this is where that breadcrumb of that cultural kind of absence and culture was. It existed. No one was archiving it. No one was celebrating it. No one was writing about it. And I had just come out of working in a place like the National Archives. So I was really, you know, in the belly of the beast, if you want, in the archive world. That's where the Home Office files are, the Foreign Commonwealth Office files, police files in particular. So I was being exposed to the kind of, you know, surveillance files from the 1930s of police looking at surveying like Muslim communities in the north and talking about their behaviors. And, you know, all of that was really creepy and unsettling to be exposed to as a, you know, as a sort of person at that age. So to move from that to suddenly like, there's these South Asian radical feminists who are setting up this archive and like celebrating and rediscovering British Asian lesbian authors from the 1940s was just like a magic and a sort of an inspiring and healing experience. So to hear all of you talking now about that time, that was a radical time, you know, and actually I think it's really important for a generation now who are being demonized as being the woke generation or the snowflakes or whatever, to understand that this tradition, you know, this is part of a tradition, a noble anti-racist tradition, which, you know, when we reopen the Birmingham Museum Art Gallery soon to mark the Commonwealth Games, there will be a display about the anti-racist movement of that period. And I think that will be really significant for that's this generation who is coming up through Black Lives Matter and experiencing all of this, to put those, you know, make those connections across time and through culture, and to understand that the anti-racism movement and culture and cultural producers and television and broadcast media and mainstream media are all deeply connected. And so many of the artists and thinkers that you're talking about, CLR James, all of those people, Stuart Hall, you know, all of those thinkers, they have informed the generation of cultural practitioners that we benefit from today. And, you know, they are able to draw on those archives and those writers because of those phenomenal founders of organizations like SADAA, who, you know, put the years in. They put over 20 years into creating this archive. And this is a lovely, you know, this is a lovely moment in that process.
Well, it's kind of quite interesting because, of course, when I took up the chair of SADAA, as you know, because I came to see you at the Museum of London, I didn't have a clue what its value was, and I didn't really know anybody who was in it. And when I went to Eastern Eye to work for Samir, which was initially, it wasn't love at first sight, was it, Samir? I remember you took me for lunch in the LWT boardroom, and my my kebab flew off the spike, and then the spike went after the kebab, and I just went and I picked it up and I went, "Have it you," and you just went. It was just like it was too awful, and I just didn't understand actually what the program was that he was describing to me. That he would like to try me out as a presenter, and I remember doing the first show. It was Shashi Kapoor. Famous
Yes.
Bollywood star, and he was talking about something, and he said, "Oh, well, it was on my kurta." And I said, "What's a kurta?"
Yes.
And
I remember
he
that.
said, "Oh, for goodness sake, you're an Asian, you should know kurta is a shirt." I didn't know it was a shirt, and Samir, of course, chose to keep that in. But the point I'm making is that I had no idea that there were first generation South Asian artists doing anything at all. I mean, I knew Madhu Jaffrey, I knew Saeed Jaffrey, but that really was it, and in the 80s, there was this sort of turning point, which I think which you are all germane to its kind of consolidation, so that we now take it for granted. Nobody thinks really in terms, I mean, we might think of a South Asian artist because we're South Asian, so we're interested in it, but nobody else is thinking, differentiating in that way if they're a great artist. But for me, it was such a surprise to learn that there were these people.
Shama, I
doing
don't
these things.
know whether you remember, we saw Mira Syar first time doing her show
Her
at
one-woman
the
show.
Edinburgh, and that we featured that, and look what happened to her. So there were some great discoveries. We tried to do a lot of Bollywood stars. I've got a picture here of Amitabh Bachchan and the LGBT. I mean, that video for Amitabh Bachchan still lives on. People still send me emails saying, "Oh, I've just seen your interview with Amitabh." Hang on, how many years ago was that?
I didn't even know who he was, actually. So that's because I'd come from Sri Lankan.
Can I just say something about this, about Channel 4 and LWT and East 9? And I think Farrukh would pick this up. Looking back, I think, and you're talking about Amitabh Bachchan, you're talking about these amazing people, that we were actually picking on the low-lying fruit. We had an amazingly vibrant culture. These were easy pickings.
Yeah.
And LWT and East 9 kind of fed off that. But there was a problem with that approach, which is that it stifled new original artistic endeavor, production endeavor amongst the British Asian community. And what happened is, and Farrukh will not pick it up, because Sue Woodford wanted to say this here. She said that most of her budget, remember, Channel 4 was meant to create an independent production sector, vibrant sector. Now, commissioning editors were meant to encourage that. If all your money went to an established LWT, you had no money to create it. So East and I, which I think they did a good job, and as we were talking about, really did showcase lots of talent. We were just picking off the easy fruit. We weren't really looking at what was going on in the grassroots. So Farrukh took the very brave decision to cancel it. Now, of course, it was popular, it was successful, but then he had to start creating an independent production base led by Black and Asian. It hasn't worked. We're still today, only last week, ITV announced yet another scheme to launch that. Channel 4 have done this. I have a slightly pessimistic idea about this, because I think the moment has passed. I think the television landscape is so changed with the arrival of streamers, with the way the decline of broadcasting, channel broadcasting, that maybe that moment where you can create your own independent television company, it may have gone, I don't know. So I think this, but let's go back then. That was Channel 4's brief. It didn't do it by commissioning East 9, Black and Black, and Farrukh then picked it up to do that.
Well, let me start by saying that when I spoke earlier, I said that creation came out of the political landscape of Britain and the situation that the new communities of Britain faced when they came here to work. Now, Britain at that time was an extremely evolving meritocracy. And it was because of this meritocracy right, which may not be true of other countries. The children of immigrants went to school, became professionals, went to universities, became artists, became articulate, and began the protest, the very strong protest. The first 1950s and 1960s workers didn't protest against racism, right? But their children and the people who subsequently saw those circumstances began to complain. And the first thing that television, which is by definition the national conversation of a nation, it's the conversation that a nation has with itself. That's what television is. They picked it up in protest programs. There was one from LWT called Skin, which was about discrimination in this, discrimination in that, discrimination, etc. And then when you ran out of discrimination, you came back to the first discrimination again, right? And so Skin was a mission to complain. Sue Woodford, on the other hand, had picked up the idea.
Can I just break in, because people who are seeing this after the recording, Sue Woodford, now Sue Hollick, was supposed to be on this panel, which is why we're referring to her. She's had to isolate, and so wasn't able to join us. But she was the first commissioning editor.
That's right.
At Channel 4, and she very gently eased us in with Eastern Eye, and then decided to drop a bomb on proceedings when Farrukh then took over from her.
Sorry, I need some clarity, because I thought that Brian Skilton, the Bacchanal program, was before Eastern Eye, really, and Sue Woodford. Same time? Sue Woodford commissioned that.
Brian Skilton, she commissioned at the same time as Arts. What happened was, the Parliament noticed that there were sections and dimensions of Britain which were not represented in the national conversation: feminism, gay activism, multiculturalism, and so on. And the Labour Party formulated the idea that we should have a remit in Parliament to set up Channel 4, which would represent things not represented on other television stations, right? Margaret Thatcher thought this would become a left-wing platform, and I'm not having it. But Willie Whitelaw persuaded her that this would be a small capitalist enterprise, and therefore you'd have people like Tariq Ali and Darcus Howe becoming capitalists who would hire and fire labor as they needed for their programs. Whitelaw saw this clearly, and he saw that it would destroy the unions of the BBC and the ACCT. And it did exactly that. So Channel 4 was born, and Jeremy Isaacs, a genius, was put in charge of it. And he recruited, amongst others, Sue Woodford, who was an absolutely pioneering innovator in education. She did not look at the mission to complain. She began to see that what you needed to join the national conversation was the culture of the Black and Asian communities. And she recruited Eastern Eye, and she started Black on Black, and she started arts programs and several other things. Amongst them, a situation comedy written by myself and Mustafa Mathura called No Problem. She commissioned that. I was very grateful. And then she commissioned after that Tandoori Nights from me, which I wrote, and it came on. So I will never say that Sue Woodford was no good. She was perfect, right? And I absolutely believe that when she left and became Lady Hollick to go to buy Charles Aznavour's house in New England.
Her life away here.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure she recommended me as commissioning editor to Jeremy Isaacs, because Jeremy called me to lunch at the Ivy, and I said, what the fuck does he want to, call me to lunch at the Ivy? He can't like my programs that much. And he said, dear boy, we want you to, Sue Hollick is leaving, and he ordered an 84 bottle of claret, for God's sake.
I don't even know what that is. 84 was a bit young then.
84 pounds.
I was just going to say that
Yeah. In
then-
83.
I remember Sue Hollick because after this, after spending money on champagne, she was the chair of London Arts for a very long time. And I worked directly with her, and she managed to continue, I think, this innovation with diversity in her chairship. I think I worked with her for maybe 9 years in terms of funding. And I remember specifically what we used to do on the board there was we created funding packages that were specifically for minority communities or specific incentivization for things. And that's really where I learned a lot about funding for the arts.
If I can just talk a bit about the BBC as well at that time, because if you remember, the BBC, from having Asian Network and what they called African Caribbean Union, they tried to lump it all together at one point, which really didn't work for lots of reasons. You know, there were tensions, etc. But with the Asian Network, and I think with Network East and whatever followed, there was always a desire, certainly on my part, the desire was to mainstream some of our culture and artists and writers that we were having on the Asian Network. So the desire was to get them into mainstream, get them onto Radio 4, get them onto 2, wherever. And I think we lost a little bit of our way while on that journey, that the Asian Network just started to be a network in its own right and maybe bring up some shutters and not open it up. My desire was that our talent would move comfortably into presenting shows on 1 and on 4. Some of that has happened more recently, but it wasn't easy to get that move.
Building on what you've just said, and bearing in mind what Samir just said about, you know, the lack of actual independent companies that come out of minority communities, British minority communities. I mean, they're not minority communities that are new to Britain. These are 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation. You know, do you think we have done enough? And in a way, Sarah, this is also at you, to create new audiences? Because, you know, at SADAA, we use the archive to take them out to communities, to show, you know, the work that Ram Gopal, Avinash Chandra, Outcast Records. We were listening to music with the video at the beginning of this event, which is the music from the John Mayer collection, the grandfather, the father of Indo jazz, and underneath us is the Birmingham Conservatoire, which still has a prize in his name every year. You know, there's so much going on. We take it out there and people really love it, but it's actually quite hard to create a new audience for the arts, so that, you know, they're not only wanting to look at Ram Gopal or Akram Khan, well, actually to even get them from Ram Gopal to Akram Khan, to get them from Akram Khan to the English National Ballet. You know, how that we seem to have failed to use our own arts to actually make communities want all arts. And I just wonder if it's just something that we sometimes sort of talk about ourselves when we're doing events.
I mean, I think it's to sort of pick up on a point that Samir made there about independent producers and the sense, I think there's a very sort of exciting shift happening in terms of that sense of producer and audience. It's not what it was when I was growing up, and that sense of broadcaster, even as an arts broadcaster or a deliverer of content, is breaking down in quite a fundamental way, so that, what we might think of rather crudely as user-generated content now, that used to be a sort of thing that you would think of as like, oh, people amateurs making their own stuff and throwing it up on YouTube or something 20 years ago, is completely different. So that sense of creating an audience or producing an audience is almost outdated in itself. You know, Birmingham's got one of the youngest populations in Europe. You walk around the city here and you will feel and see that sense of multicultural or kind of minority arts, it's just light years away now. So when you look at the kind of artists that we work with and the creatives in this city, they're not audience waiting to be cultivated in some sort of slightly passive sense. They're as likely to be making their own art or music or blog posts or anything else and publishing it. And, you know, of course, some very stubborn kind of inequalities exist around means of production and accessing those kind of big pots of money to, you know, reach a larger audience. But I think the next wave of kind of cultural consumption is going to be much more dispersed and much more, it's narrow casting in a sense, but people and audiences, and particularly young people, are deciding their kind of content creation systems for themselves. So it isn't, we can't even really speak in the same way post digital now about cultivating audiences in that slightly almost kind of sort of social engineering mode that you could when I was growing up and you had like 3 television channels. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, actually. It makes me think, as chair of SADAA, that we're more important than ever in a strange way, because in a way we may become an anomaly at some point, not very far.
See, I think it's a really
ahead.
interesting debate. I absolutely get what you're saying there, but I would say that it's the opposite of what Sean was suggesting. I mean, this idea that you have an artistic form that can reach out to a wider audience, I think is a good thing. I think when you develop, as there now are the platforms that can just talk to each other, so all you happen to do is listen and hear artists that you like. You shut yourself off from other forms of art that don't belong to that world. And there's a whole worry about narrow casting that this new technology has allowed us to do, is actually narrowing people's ideas of what is art. And I think this idea that we should try and create art that speaks to everyone, so people come across it, encounter it, and not just restrict yourself to the bits that you like.
So our grime culture isn't like that, is it? Like that music came out of bedrooms and housing estates, and now it's like worldwide.
My age. That.
Yeah, but the point stands is that it's not narrow. It's not necessary that it's narrow casting, or that a kind of group within a group is just making its own echo chamber and listening to this music over there. You know, the talent will out, and a kind of creative energy behind that. I mean, you know, I don't know how well you know Birmingham, but you feel it in this city. And you will see in like 15 years from now, you will see the sort of, it's the Harlem Renaissance of the 21st century is happening here. And you will see those kind of forms of culture. They are storming, culture, and it's just a different, whole.
I don't know. The only point I was making that it would be good if it does spread beyond the narrow casting and tries to reach out to bigger audiences, as Sharma was suggesting. Yeah. I think that's a good.
Yeah. Do you think there are dangers to society if we carry on only talking amongst ourselves? Because I don't think they do. I echo what you were saying. If you look around the city, from poetry to jazz, etc., young people are finding lots of different.
No, I think that you use the right phrase. I think there's a danger in the echo chamber at the moment. The echo chamber does exist, but mainly in political discourse. It would be a tragedy if it happened in artistic discourse as well.
But can I just say, but I feel that there's a lot of young people who are now engaged in art. They're very conscious of their identity, whatever it is, in terms of their heritage, much more so than their politics of the work. So from that point of view, I sort of disagree with what you're saying to some of it, because everywhere I see all the kind of marketing materials is out of its way to emphasize somebody's cultural heritage, where they come from, etc. Not what informs the politics of their art or why are they doing something. It's more like, oh, this person is half Asian, half this, that biracial. I see it everywhere. So I'm not sure that I agree with what you're saying, Sarah, that in the sense of people are becoming like very narrow in terms of the kind of arts that the way that they're creating art. So, or they don't see heritage in the same way, because I feel like to a certain degree that we are actually going back to really pushing our heritage and cultural identity in the forefront of the arts work.
You mean a kind of identity politics in
pretty
culture?
Much,
I mean, this is perhaps another debate, but I would say that there's a different sort of, the wheel has turned again, and that there's a confidence perhaps behind that, which it might from the outside sometimes look a bit like a heavy-handed form of identity politics. But actually, growing up in the 70s and 80s in a place like Essex, which was, very kind of, we've all been talking about what the 70s and 80s was like. Just embracing a British Asian culture and identity was a very daring and radical thing, it felt like at that time. So to see this generation now kind of foregrounding identity in a different way, I think actually I would say it's not, doesn't feel, again in Birmingham, doesn't feel like an act of a depoliticized generation, but a generation that is, you know, they're forming and wrangling with their own kind of forms of politics and culture. And it's just different than the one that I grew up with or that we had in the 60s and
And
70s.
yet, if I can stop you there, that is precisely what all the artists in our archive were doing in their own way.
Exactly.
With their own political backgrounds and their own sense of identity and their identity cultures. And it's absolutely what we captured. It's absolutely what all of this top-down money and top-down planning was intended in some way, shape or form to capture. And I think I'm going to stop you all at this point because it seems to me that's the kind of perfect ending, because you are now throwing forward to what it's going to look like as we continue on our current trajectory. And yet it ties in because, of course, it's all about the need for self-expression and the fact that I think this generation unlocked the opportunity for self-expression and funded the opportunity for self-expression and enabled, just through opening arms, opportunities and minds, actually, because we've touched on the feminist and the gender politics, sexual politics. You know, we did so much, and what is really hopeful is that, you know, we will continue to get that sort of support at some level always from authority and organisations. So thank you, Sara Wajid, Anita Bhalla, Keith Khan, Suman Bhuchar, Farrukh Dhondy, Samir Shah. I'm sorry to say I have to just ruin this by now holding up the hawk and the hyena, which is Farrukh's new book. And he has just given me this very fresh copy of it. And actually I'm sticking it up here because I'm archiving it right now.
But I want to say, Shama, just to add to that, the main thing is that we are still, you know, we are still working right now. We are still trying to use the same sort of politics to continue to tell our stories, the stories that we want to tell, except we're a bit older, you know. So
well, it doesn't leave you, does it? And that isn't that actually the artistic imperative? Is that your politics will always drive you, and the day that they stop, it's time to just put on your slippers and sit down and eat a masala dosa.
Farrukh Dhondy continues to write.
Yeah, which is why Farrukh Dhondy continues to write. Why are we doing Farrukh Dhondy? Forget him. What's really important is the SADAA. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.